I think people are just starting to log in here to our happiness hour on Thursday. We'll see. You are all welcome, of course, to keep cameras off if you wish. And we welcome you to use the chat function if at any time you have questions. Hello, welcome everybody.
Hello, everybody.
So I will kick things off and would love to welcome you to our Happiness Hour event. I am Pam Armour and I represent Minnesota Personalized Medicine. And this is the clinic where we are thrilled to bring you these happiness hours, which are our fun, non-pharmaceutical ways of teaching ways to help you in these 5 fundamentals of optimal wellness, which are eating, breathing, sleeping, moving, and loving. A lot of times we think about health as being primarily pharmaceuticals or doctor visits, but there's so much more beyond just that. And today we're here to talk about discovering your story, finding your voice. And we're thrilled to have our new integrative health and wellness coach, Jill Patton, here to join us and to teach us something new. Jill, with that, I would love to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Pam. You're a graceful and gracious host. Thanks for that. That was nice. Hi, everyone. I have met some of you. My name is Jill Patton. As Pam says, I am an integrative health and wellness coach with Minnesota Personalized Medicine. I'm also a writer and an editor, and I specialize in magazine articles and other content focusing on health and wellness. I'm a lover of stories, and I'm fascinated by the stories that people tell about their lives and the meaning they take from those stories and the choices that they make based on those stories. And part of my health coaching work is guiding people to discover and understand the stories that govern their lives and support them as they work to write new stories, whether that's literally writing or figuratively in the actions that they take, so that might be more empowering or take them in a direction that they want to go in their life and their health. So tonight's happiness hour is going to have 2 parts. I'm going to give just a short presentation about the power of story in our lives and our health. And then I'm going to introduce you to a friend of mine, Seton Hanville. Seton, you can wave. Say hi. Seton, and she has a very important story to share about her own health journey. She's a friend of mine. We actually met when we graduated from health coaching school. We were both on the same virtual graduation, and she said, "Hey, I'm in Minnesota too." And that's how we became friends. She's also a patient here at Minnesota Personalized Medicine. So I'll talk with her for probably about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for a little Q&A at the end. If you are interested and have questions, please feel free to leave your questions and thoughts in the chat. Pam's going to be monitoring that. We'll look to answer questions toward the end, but if anything urgent comes up in the middle, she's going to jump in and ask me if we need to touch on something or go deeper on something. My hope for you is that tonight you will start to notice the stories in your life a little bit more, and you might start to wonder whether your stories are serving you and the health that you desire. And I also hope that in hearing Seton's story, you might see new possibilities for your own as you work to claim greater health. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen and hope that this all works the way I want to. Practice. So do you see a picture of a cattle pen in Southeast Kansas?
Yes.
Good. I grew up in suburban Kansas City, so not anywhere near these cattle pens, but these are in the Flint Hills of Kansas, and it's one of my favorite places. So go here. Good. We see it? All right. So this presentation is called Discovering Your Story, Finding Your Voice. And I'm going to start with a pretty bold assertion that we are all storytellers. Even those of us who don't think of ourselves as creative or storyteller-y, we are. Our lives are comprised of stories. From the time we are born, story is a part of our lived experience. And humans, from the time we've been around, have always told stories as a way to convey information about the hunt, to make sense of the world around us. We connect through story. We form relationships through story. And Story is part of how we develop the skills of empathy. It's how we understand each other and feel part of a community, feel less alone. And the thing that I think is super interesting and kind of blows my mind a little bit is that our brains are actually wired for story. Our brains are constantly seeking ways to create meaningful, coherent exploration of the world around us. So as our sensory nervous system takes in sights and sounds and tactile experiences, smells, our brain is constantly constructing a story, a narrative. It's bringing it in, it's contextualizing that information into the larger experience of our life. From an evolutionary perspective, and this is where it's really amazing to me, storytelling is actually an adaptation that has helped us survive as a species. I found this statement in a book that I was reading about story from this philosopher and writer named Daniel Dennett. He says, our fundamental tactic of self-protection, self-control, and self-definition is not spinning webs or building dams, but telling stories. And in particular, concocting and controlling the stories we tell others and ourselves about who we are. So let's define our terms about what is story. If you were like me and sort of an English class nerd, you might remember the definition of story from like a novel or a short story where there is one. I see someone. There is an exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and a resolution. Or if you're really a story nerd, you might know about Joseph Campbell, the comparative mythologist, comparative religion professor. He came up with the idea of the monomyth or the hero's journey, in which a character is called to an adventure. He usually rejects the call, goes on an adventure, and returns transformed. So think of Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, any of those. Those are great definitions, but that's not what we're going to work with today. So in terms of our health story, for a working definition, stories are events linked in sequence across time. That's it. Events linked in sequence across time. What happens is when we connect and we interpret these events in sequence across time, we create meaning. And that interpretation, that meaning making becomes the plot of our lives. And the really good news is we get to say what these events in sequence across time mean. Now, that is easier said than done, right? If the events in our lives have been hard, if they've been traumatic, if we've lacked agency because we were young or in some other way disempowered, we may need healing work to be able to do that. We may need therapy, we may need coaching, we may need journaling, time and perspective. But in the end, even, regardless if we do the work, we are the ones who tell our stories. The stories we tell ourselves about our lives, of course, reflect our beliefs, right? They reflect our values, they reflect what we want, what we fear. They reflect the decisions we've made and actions we've taken. But it goes both ways, right? So stories also affect and in turn reinforce the actions we will take, the decisions we will make, what we fear, what we're taught to desire, what we value and believe. And it goes in a circular way and it can work against us or for us. So if we have a story that we never do anything right, and this is based on something that we've been told to believe or things that we fear, the experiences we have that tell us that, then the choices that we make and the things that we're going to do are going to be affected by that story. So understanding our stories and where they come from is really important. Oops, here we go. Not only are we storytellers, we are authors. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with Brené Brown, and this is from her book, Rising Strong. She writes, when we deny our stories, they define us. When we run from struggle, we are never free. So we turn toward truth and look it in the eye. We will not be characters in our stories, not villains, not victims, not even heroes. We are the authors of our lives. There are two things I like about this quote. One is that we must honor our stories, even if we're carrying around stories that are painful or stories that don't serve us. We can and arguably must acknowledge what we've experienced to be true before we can write new stories for ourselves. The other thing that I think is really interesting about this is that Brene Brown dispenses with this idea that we are the heroes of our own story, let alone victims or villains, which I think, would be really interesting if we could arrange it so that she and Joseph Campbell could have a conversation about this. I wonder how that would have gone. And I'm curious how others feel about this. So if you want, go ahead. I'm curious what you think. I know there have been times when I have felt like a hero in my life. I know there have times when I have felt like a victim. And there have been times when I have felt that some aspect of myself is the bad guy. Maybe I'm at war with my body. So I think what this quote really says to me, in the end, none of these characters is an adequate reflection of who we are. We're all of them and we're none of them. But ultimately, we are our life's author. And so that's great, Jill. What does this have to do with my health? And so anyone who has ever faced a health challenge, of course, has a story to tell. These events are woven into our lives' narrative. And if you've had a significant health crisis, or if you live with chronic illness or chronic pain, these stories can get very complicated, complex. They can get very interwoven, and it can be hard to tease out where these storylines come from, especially with our health stories. We almost always have multiple co-authors. So if you think about how your parents responded to illness or injury, yours or theirs or anyone else's, does that still influence how you respond to illness or injury? Is it everything is like a big panic or everything's fine? Like what's that response like then and now? The experiences and perspectives of our friends and family may unconsciously be internalized by us as well. Things we've read or situations we've observed all kind of fill into the way we interpret our stories. And of course, some of the most powerful co-authors of our health story are doctors and other experts whose job it is to interpret your experience of illness or pain or injury through diagnosis, prognosis, and advice. And the problem is not in having co-authors. That's our life. We're all part of a giant story, right? And our stories are always influencing each other. I think what the problem is when we're not aware of or in control of who is co-authoring our stories with us. So tonight we are going to do a little storytelling. More specifically, we're going to go back and look at one woman's health story and then hear how she has learned over time to claim primary authorship of her story and therefore her life, even in the face of significant health challenges. So we waved at Seton, and I'll stop sharing in just a minute. But when she and I were planning this, we were talking about the best way to talk about her story. And Seton and I have spent, I don't know, dozens of hours talking about life and health and story. She's fascinating, and we're going to cap this at we're going to pay attention to the time. But I think we decided the best way for her to share her personal insights about her story is if we start by laying out some basic facts about her life on a timeline. And maybe you've seen this if your doctor works with a timeline in terms of developing a diagnosis. We're going to use this to look at the patterns that she might have found and get into the lessons of what she learned looking at her timeline through a conversation. So I'm going to do that now. So Seton, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and talk through the things that we said we're going to put on the timeline.
Yep.
And then I'll stop sharing my screen and she and I will chat for about 30 minutes. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Feel free to put your questions in the chat if you'd like, however makes sense for you. So here are some key things to keep in mind as we think about the story that Seton and I will be talking about. She had a traumatic birth injury that left her in acute pain for the first 6 months of her life, if you can imagine that. Her mom had Crohn's disease, which in the time that she was growing up, she explains was almost always a deadly disease. And Seton can explain this better, but her mom effectively died several times. And Seton, it was, you know, at the bedside when her mom is dying and then reviving multiple times, which you can imagine is very upsetting to a child. Seton developed an eating disorder in adolescence. She survived an assault as a young adult. As an adult, she went through a divorce and became the single mom of a medically complicated child and was in a position to need to advocate for him in an environment that wasn't conducive to that. She really had to go toe to toe with a lot of experts. And she'll talk a little bit about that as well. In midlife, she developed Hashimoto's, which you might know is an autoimmune hypothyroid disorder, and is now a patient at NPM for connective tissue hypersensitivity, hypermobility disorder. And yeah, so these are just some facts. These are just facts. And I think what's really important is now for us to talk about what Seton made of these facts and how she lives her life now. So I'll just, does that make sense for everybody? You don't need to memorize this. So I'm going to stop sharing. And then Pam, if you wouldn't mind, well, I don't, you know what? Yeah, we can do it. We could do the spotlight. That's fine. We're not a big group, but she's going to put us this way. Cool.
Okay.
All right. So Seton, hold on. Let me get my notes real quick. So thank you again for sharing your story. It's really nice to have this here. When we, there are a lot of big and traumatic events on your timeline. And
Yeah.
I thought what was interesting was when I asked you to describe your story, including how you got to where you are now and how you approach your life now, you didn't start with these health events. So I'm gonna quote what you said, and we'll jump off there. So when I asked you, like, how do you describe your story? You said, my story is the journey of a woman who lived unconsciously, defined by external expectations, who learned to live from her core self and to examine the stories and beliefs that had governed her life. She learned to live from the inside out rather from the outside in, and to navigate her health journey in the process. Shall I repeat that? Does that feel like maybe we should hear that again? I want to say that one more time and then we'll go into it, okay? So Seton's story is the journey of a woman who lived unconsciously, defined by external expectations, who learned to live from her core self and to examine the stories and beliefs that had governed her life. She learned to live from the inside out rather than the outside in, and to navigate her health journey in the process. So what do you mean by living unconsciously and defined by external expectations?
Oh, let's see if we can keep this short. What I've come to understand is that, to me, that means satisfying external expectations at the sacrifice of your authenticity and your needs for everything and everyone else around you. Living up to social expectations, living up to relational expectations, living up to someone else's or something else's terms of how you can or should be, which therefore completely pulls you out of being in tune with yourself, your emotional self, your spiritual self, your physical self. And I then developed a pattern of living life to meet all those external expectations and definitions.
What did that look like?
Having perfect grammar that was very important in our home, and behaving according to all kinds of old school 1950s etiquette rules, because I'm going into my 8th decade, so we're going way back. But being who and whatever anyone or anything else wanted you to be in whatever environment you found yourself in, whether it was work, whether it was home, whether it was a church structure.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying some of these stories came from family, some came
Absolutely.
from the culture that you were swimming in. Would you say any of your early health experiences reinforced these beliefs and these stories about who you were supposed to be?
Well, since really understanding the birth trauma and looking at that and digging into the literature on trauma, I've come to understand that because of my birth injury, my nervous system was hard coded. I mean, 6 months in the life of a newborn is a long period of time. So I was with this birth injury, and my nervous system was encoded to expect life to be painful, that pain was the definition of being in this world.
Mm.
You can imagine the psychological and spiritual ramifications of that baseline further on in life. You don't come to expect anything good. You don't come to expect anything joyful or easy. You get identified with really being in the trenches, and that is what life is. And then the severity of my mother's Crohn's disease back in the 60s, she was born in 1923, and at that point in time, that was considered a disease only of childhood because most people who had it didn't survive to be adults. My mother was actually, she was in the Guinness Book of World Records for a while as the longest living Crohn's patient of her generation. But she had outstanding physicians and she had an outstanding perspective. So I had a master class growing up as her daughter in coping with severe adversity and
So
how
on
to
one
find
hand,
humor, and that just defined everything.
that's interesting to me because on one hand, you have this unconscious story because you were a
Yeah.
child, you were pre-verbal, you told me you didn't even really kind of put it together until you're much, much older.
Oh, you wouldn't. Yeah.
Right. From your birth injury. At the same time, you see these tools of resilience being implemented in your mom's story.
Right.
But that was also a hard story for you to watch her go through.
Right. Because it's extremely abnormal to have a mother that's resuscitated 6 times and to spend a lot of time in the hospital
Yeah.
because this is before managed care. She had an extraordinary physician who had retired from the University of Chicago and took over a local clinic. And she'd be in the hospital for months at a time. And I was allowed to be there and we would visit for entire days.
Yeah.
So I would just hang out. And as long as I behaved well and stayed out of everywhere I wasn't supposed to go into, as long as I was a good girl, I could just be there. And I saw a lot and I learned a great deal, but with the mind of a child. And that's where story really rolls into it, because as we move through developmental stages, we absorb our life experiences with those certain contexts.
Right.
And a lot of the contexts we operate on, I look back now and can see how, boy, this version of this story served me really well for that period. Where it became a problem is when I carried it into a different period of my life because I wasn't aware that I was working out things that way.
Right. So that's kind of what we were talking about earlier. It's like there's a context for understanding when you were a disempowered child that was a survival story.
Yeah.
That no longer served you as an adult dealing with adult challenges of health challenges with an adult's mindset.
Right.
What impact do you think the stories of your childhood and also living by, being the good girl, doing all these things right, had on your health?
It's very stressful.
Mm.
It's very, very stressful because instead of getting just to be how you feel and who you are always having to mold that into fitting someone else's requirements of what's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the state of just being was something that was very foreign to me. I didn't really experience a state of just being unless I was out in nature, or what really clarified it for me was when I studied and got trained in mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Mm-hmm.
That's when the power of beingness really became clear for me, and how I could just, oh, I want to be this way instead of all this other push, 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 strive, 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 strive.
The power of beingness.
Mm-hmm.
So that I'm curious because that is living from the inside out, right? If you can be. So the name of this is Discovering Your Story, Finding Your Voice, or Finding Your Voice, Discovering Story. Finding your voice, like what did it take for you to find your voice?
It took many years of living outside of my deep self and the level of emotional pain and stress and difficulty that not being authentic in this, the way that Gabor Mate talks about authenticity versus attachment and fitting in, until I finally reached some pressure points. And there were some, just a couple of different watershed points. It was like I hit, oh, hell no kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Where it was, I didn't know how I was going to change things. I didn't know how I was going to approach things differently, but I knew I wasn't going to continue to live my life or handle situation X in the way I had in the past, because that just wasn't working anymore.
So we talked about one of these agency moments being when you were a newly single mom with a son with a medical complex situation.
4th of July. Yeah. Yeah.
4th of July.
Okay. I was, my son was 5 years old, and we were at the park in the late afternoon, 4th of July, myself and the mothers of 5 of his friends, and everybody else was married. I was the only single mom. And I heard one of the moms at the end of the group, the other end of the group, saying, "Oh, poor Seton, and her son, she's a single mother, and he's got, blah, 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 all these different problems and all these different issues, and nothing good is ever going to happen for them. And they're going to have a bad outcome because, single mothers just don't ever have a good outcome." And I got transformationally angry. I got so angry. It's like a cold anger where you don't go into the whole spewing anger thing, but just like, oh no, that is so not going to happen. And lady, parenthood is a long game, and we'll see what happens in 20 years. So that launched me, that moment literally launched me in a different direction to decide that we were not going to become statistics. My son was not going to have a bad outcome. Neither was I. And our lives were going to move forward. And I didn't know how I was going to do that, but I was going to find a way to start to change things.
So that was, like you said, a watershed moment, a switch from agency of not feeling in control.
A switch from a state of non-agency.
Non-agency, yeah.
And because for me, being a single mother was probably the thing in life that I was most scared of at that point. And there I was, the single mom of a medically complicated kid. So I had a lot to learn. I had to grow new ways of looking at things and new ways of dealing with things and new ways of being in order to achieve what I wanted to achieve. So that was, as you said, an agency moment where that began a sense of transformational change for me, where I started living my life differently. I started being in myself differently. I started forming boundaries. I started looking at what brought me happiness, what did not bring me happiness, what made me feel good, what did not make me feel good. And because my performance needs were so high during that period, I started to take better care of myself. I started to pay attention to the way I ate. I started to pay attention to, was I getting enough sleep? And understanding that those lifestyle and mind body things made a difference. But that was just the beginning of a much longer journey that took probably about 20 years.
Right. It's not like it just turns on and now,
no,
taken care of.
It happened for me in layers.
In layers. So
yeah.
Would you describe that experience as this layering as an experience of discovery?
Oh, yes, because in that desire to move forward, I placed myself in circumstances where I had to discover, where I had to find my voice.
So,
and I had to be able to say to doctors what was acceptable to me, what was not acceptable to me. And at this time, everything had to do with my son. So
can you give an example of that? I mean,
what types of treatments were okay and what types of treatments didn't fit. At one point, we had a psychiatrist tell me very quickly at an initial session that my son had oppositional defiant disorder. And I just felt in my gut that that was not what was going on with this kid. So I had to learn to stand up and say, thank you very much for your perspective. I appreciate your time and I respect your opinion. However, I don't believe you're the person who can help us.
That's a lot of bravery.
Yeah, it was just like, saying, okay, stop. This is not going to happen. I could not agree with it. And it was a whole visceral feeling that this was the wrong person to help my son.
So that came from within you viscerally.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that was one of the first times, in fact, going through the whole thing of having to advocate for my son, that's where I cut my teeth on and developed my self-advocacy skills.
And say a little bit about that. I'm curious what.
And I think that's pretty typical for women who are moms is we will do things for our kids long before we will do stuff for ourselves.
Right.
So
Right.
having a medically complicated kid, I had to learn all kinds of new stuff. I had some things, experiences that I could pull from growing up so close to medical practitioners and how much time I spent as a kid in medical environments because of my mother. But things moved along and grew from there.
Well, you actually went and got a master's in public health.
Yes, I did. And I was very strategic about that. I looked at the curriculum of the university I wanted to get it from and saw how much emphasis they put on understanding research, study, and design, because I also had to read a lot of research studies when my son was small. And I had to be able to speak the language uh, of research studies, and medicine and medical issues are written very specifically in those types of publications. And I had to understand the implications of them. And so, yeah, I got an MPH. It
And
also
that
helped me with the schools because when you walk into a meeting with a medical professional and or the insurance companies and or the school system, if you have letters after your name, you are treated differently.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I learned that and acquired that. I acquired that status and I acquired those skills. I think one of the best things I came out of graduate school was I can deconstruct research studies. I can examine how they're written. I can translate medicalese.
Yeah.
That's medical verbiage and everyday language are things I speak equally well, which
You're
served me as a
bilingual.
health coach and through my coaching because then I could very easily translate complicated medical stuff to people and help them understand why it makes a difference in their lives or what it basically means.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier that you had gotten training in mindfulness-based stress reduction. Is it
Yes.
sort of all in the same period of time?
Gosh, when did that happen? Um, this was in my adulthood after my son was he was already in high school. I'd say during his high school years.
Okay.
I
I'm
got,
just wondering, 'cause
oh,
that
no,
has to,
sorry. It started in middle school. Sorry, everybody. I have to think about this a little bit because it goes way back.
well, I guess
Um,
what I'm hearing is a combination of obviously cognitive skills that you learned so you could do the advocacy work you needed to do for your son.
right.
There's also an embodiment. There's also because you also teach qigong.
Well,
And
yeah, it was part of it was also basically how did I not lose my mind under all this pressure? Because I
right.
have no siblings and I had no family members around. So it was just me and this medically complicated child. So how did I parent? How did I get through day to day? You know, how did I navigate all of this? What skills did I need to acquire in order to do that? How did I need to be and how did I need to live to pull that off?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I, by happenstance, fell into a Tai Chi class at a park district and found out that I liked it. But then I heard about Qigong and found out that I liked that even more because I felt so incredibly good when I did it. Now, what I understand about the nervous system and trauma and those mind body practices, I can really understand why I took like a duck to water to MBSR and Qigong because they addressed my core needs. And I didn't realize it at the time. It just felt really right.
Right. But it was
So I
working
gave myself
under the
permission
radar.
to learn about that, start doing it, and then opportunities just presented themselves. I wrote to UMass back in 1995. They had their original professional internship in mindfulness-based stress reduction, and I got accepted to the program. So things did fall in place. And then I continued to study Qigong for a while. And then when a really good teacher certification course came up, I was able to pull together the resources to do that and to get the certification. And I did that as well.
So as you're embracing these and then also teaching these things, you are then actually starting to live, like you said, from the inside out.
Oh,
Not
yes,
only
because,
from your own
yeah,
internal knowledge, from your own embodied experience.
yep.
How would you say now that that has supported you during your health and healing journey? Because a lot of that happened before your Hashi. I mean, you'd had experiences when you were younger, but then I'm a period of relative physical health for you, right? But then you were diagnosed in your 40s or 50, I think you said, with Hashimoto.
2009, I got the autoimmune diagnosis.
Right. So how would all of the skills and the tools you acquired in that period, how's that supported you now with Hashimoto's
Oh,
and
hugely,
yeah,
because um, stress has stress affects everything about us physically negatively. It also affects us emotionally negatively. It affects us spiritually negatively. Um, but learning those mind body practices and getting relief from my own stress helped bumped up my stress management skills.
yeah.
And so as I learned about nutrition, also that bumped up my life care skills. So as I'm learning to take care of my son, I'm also learning things that help me take care of me.
Mhm. So it affects, like you said, it affects the choices that you're making in
Right.
terms of how you nourish yourself, how you take care of your body. How does it affect now, like what you see as possible? I mean, like you've got,
Right.
so
Well,
you,
I want to back up a step because
yeah.
possible is a very important word. During this period of getting these different skills and beginning to expand my toolbox
Mhm.
under the auspices of learning how to do things that would just also allow me more self-expression as well. So in a sense, that was spiritual self-care.
Yeah.
I also learned to begin to look at life through the lens of what's possible here. And that's something that began in learning how to find people who could help me care for my son.
Okay.
And up until that point in my life, I had always lived life through the lens of what am I supposed to do here? Not what's possible, not what could work, not what might be best, but it was just a lot of have tos before then. So things sort of organically developed so that when my health stuff hit the fan, after I had gotten him pretty well taken care of, I used all the skills and abilities and things that I had learned and insights that I had gained over those years and applied them to my own care,
Okay.
to my own path of finding physicians, to my own path of understanding who could help me, who could not. Also, the realization that doctors are just people and they have limits as well. And when I would find a practitioner that I would have a good start with, but then we would hit a wall, not to get upset about it or to fall into a sense of emotional loyalty toward the practitioner or despair, just release that and go find someone who had the skill set that I needed.
Right. Because in the end, you needed to take care of yourself.
Absolutely.
So yeah, there's self advocacy. You've also talked a lot about, we've had conversations about self-talk.
Yeah, yeah,
The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, the stories we
yes,
tell ourselves about the situation we're in this moment.
yeah.
And I wonder if you would share like how you talk to yourself, like when an episode of POTS comes on and you are, I mean, I think that, I mean, I've told that story to other people and I always tear up when I think about how you talk to yourself when things aren't going well, when you are having a struggle.
Well, just to put this in context for everyone, I was diagnosed with MCAS, POTS, and
LSD.
hypermobile EDS.
Yeah.
Was it
Oh,
last year? Yeah, that diagnosis finally came through last year. And I was in a very acute stage of flaring for about 6 months. And I hadn't encountered this before. And when the POTS showed up fully, um, it was a challenge just to get to the bathroom. Now, mind you, I had been a Qigong instructor for years at this point, have great reflexes and tremendous proprioception. But when that context gets pulled out from under you, how do you get out of your bed and get to the bathroom? So that's where my MBSR kicked in and my
mindfulness-based
Qigong
stress
kicked in
reduction.
combination. And you're saying, okay, we're going to sit up in stages now. So we would sit up a little bit from laying down. And if that worked out, then a little bit more. And that worked out and a little bit more. And it was like, okay, that worked. This is great. I put my intention into my hands, which were touching the bed, and into my legs and my feet, which are touching the rest of the bed and the floor, and saying, okay, your head's offline, but the rest of you is working fine. Let's do a few breaths and let's see what's going. And then step by step would get myself to the bathroom, very gently standing up, seeing how that worked, holding my hand against a wall, holding my hand against the bed, and then one step at a time, one breath at a time, getting to where I needed to go. And then being done in the bathroom, using the same process to get back to bed. And you have to remember that I'm a person who tends to move pretty fast a lot of the times.
You're a little
So
Speedy
I was used to
Gonzalez.
just zipping around.
Yeah.
So this learning, the POTS was a huge learning experience for me, as is MCAS, as was, the hypermobility. That didn't surprise me because nobody picked up on it. And when I was a kid, it was so long ago that I was a child. Nobody paid attention to the bumps on my feet. Nobody paid attention to how abnormally flexible I was. They just called you a bendy kid, or you were just called double jointed. Well, then when all kinds of gastrointestinal stuff flared. So I'm just old enough to where medicine hadn't caught up with a lot of things and doctors didn't connect the dots.
But what really strikes me, like again, I've told that story of you and how you've talked to yourself. Because the other thing that it gives me chills. Because the other thing that you said is that you were also, I don't mind if you don't mind, I tell a little piece of your story for you, just because I think it's important. You also thanked the part of yourself that wasn't working because you knew that it was trying to revert, it was trying to find homeostasis, it was trying to heal.
Yeah, that came a little later because, when everything initially flared up, I just reverted to my training and dug into the literature. And now there are so many great videos online from credible sources. So I found out who the world's experts were in this and the people who were the first ones to really pay attention and write up and do good clinical work on it. So I dug into that and I read all that stuff, which turned out to be kind of depressing. And I thought, okay, this is big stuff. I wasn't anticipating it. This isn't where I wanted to go. I haven't done my coaching boards yet, but this is what is. So again, that was an interweaving of mindfulness practice and such, and pulling that out and learning to be with what is, but not be reactive to it.
I think that's important. The responses versus reactions, right?
Yes, response versus reaction. And then after looking at all this, videos and recordings of grand rounds and literature for 3 months, I came to a point where one day I was just feeling really down about things. And I thought, oh, I'm starting to feel like my body is my enemy. And I just had an all over sensation that that was not the place I wanted to go.
Yeah.
And I reminded myself of how much our body is constantly working well beyond our awareness ever to bring us into a state of balance, well-being, and homeostasis. And I thought, okay, well, this might be offline, this might be offline, this might be happening, but my legs are working great. This is working fine. I'm breathing really fine. My heart is doing extremely well. And so that was the point, was when something would flare up, I would regard it, but my attention went to, well, what's working? Instead of going into a level of anxiety that I typically had when I was a teenager and such, and just getting very upset, getting very scared, being very dominated by fear. Saying, okay, this is happening, but look at all this over here. What is working? What is not working?
Bringing yourself out of a state of panic.
Not even, I was fortunate to not get into a state of panic, recognizing the seeds of something like that.
Yeah.
Or recognizing the seeds of a fear response and saying, okay, I hear you fear response. Just sitting down and sometimes just hugging myself and saying, okay, I'm really breathing and I'm breathing really well. And I don't have to pay any attention to that. And I'm very flexible, and just looking at, and at times just going through lists of what's working today. This is really great today. That's really great today. And not in a false positive sense, but in an acknowledge of what the balance is for me in those moments.
So I'm looking at the time and I want to leave plenty of time for questions and further conversation, but before we do that, I mean, I feel like if anyone's been taking notes, there are a million lessons that we can all take from your journey to help us discover our own stories and find our own voices. But if you had a word of advice for anyone who is starting on a health journey or who's been on it for a while and they're frustrated and they're tired, what would you offer?
I would offer a very mindful hug in the sense of suggesting self-compassion and removal of self-judgment, and encourage curiosity and a learning perspective. Because that can bring you back to the question of, well, what's possible here? Or what's possible in this moment? And then the next moment shows up and it's what's possible in that moment. And you can carry that into a day, and then you can carry that into a week, and you can carry that from year to year.
Thank you. That's beautiful and so helpful. So I wanted to see if anyone had questions, and we can go off of this spotlight mode if you want, if you don't mind, Pam. Maybe I can remove my own. There's here I am.
Okay. I think we have them removed, right?
Well, there we are. So we're all here together again. So yeah, does anyone have any questions or thoughts, Dr. Plotnikoff?
Well, thank you, Seaton, and thank you, Jill. This is, I really appreciate your sharing and your insights today. I love this point. What am I supposed to do versus what's possible here? And I just want to just highlight that and highlight also the fact that in this theme of authoring one's story, that there are times where you identify that others were trying to author your story. And like the mom who was saying something about predicting your future and your son's future. And it's just like, oh, you identify, no, that's not the story here. Future does not yet exist. Thank you very much. And it's like, okay, we're going to be creating our own story. No need for you to comment or even curse us what that future may be. And I just want to highlight that because you and Jill are going to be doing, and the NPM team has probably heard this, but this whole idea that we physicians, myself included, are at risk of cursing people. That is, telling people what their story is. And Jill, you pointed out, we interpret these via diagnosis, prognosis, and advice. And I said interpret, but we don't want to make declarative statements about the future. The future open to possibilities. And this is made really, really, really clear in this community. And back in the 1980s, when the Hmong community was just encountering the medical system for the first time. And sometimes kids get appendicitis, and appendicitis requires surgery. And the worst possible thing in the Hmong culture that time was any opening in the body, because it could result in loss of soul. And there literally was a father who had broke into an operating room with a gun to rescue his son from surgery. Loving, caring parent, thinking they were doing the best for their child. And what we found is that the interpreters taught us, you cannot say, if your child doesn't have this surgery, they will die. In this case, we just heard, you have been cursed. You have cursed the future. But you can say, if your child does not have the surgery, they may not get better. Completely changes the conversation, the tone, the partnership. And so that's why I think focusing on possibilities is so great, and not letting anyone else limit the possibilities. So there's just a huge thing, and having someone else tell your story is really, or even tell you what your story should be, or so thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, Tamira.
I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your story. So much of it resonates with me and some similarities, which is also interesting.
Mm.
And I feel like I myself, people always feel sad for you for illness, but I've also found a lot of gifts in it. And that being really pushing me to look at, like you were talking about, boundaries, what's important, what makes me happy, what feels, and really getting more clear and setting boundaries and learning how to, I guess, in the process of learning how to live inside out, from the inside out versus the other. But I just really loved a lot of the ways you just really presented them with clarity and a lot of wisdom. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. I was hoping this would be useful for people.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, I just wanted to share a couple of resources. I'm going to share my screen
Mm,
again,
great.
throw them up there. See if I can do this right. So there we were. I am going to be sending along, for anyone who registered, and we can go beyond that if we want, Pam, just an exercise where you'll have the opportunity to place some key moments of your health journey along a timeline, as well as some questions you can ask of yourself or journal if you'd like about your health story. And here are some further resources if you're interested in this sort of exploration into story as a way to understand your health and opportunities, possibilities for moving forward. Here are a few books. You also might find coaching helpful. I'm a health coach as well. On my website, you're welcome to schedule a free 30-minute conversation just to get a sense of what coaching is and whether it might be a fit. I'm also looking forward to looking to put together a group of people who might be interested in exploring story together over a course of weeks. So I'm working with Dr. Plotnikoff and his team about what that could look like and who might be interested, but I'll be communicating about that as that develops. And I just want to thank you all for being here this evening. A special thank you to Minnesota Personalized Medicine for hosting this happiness, and especially to Seton for sharing your personal story and, in the hopes that this is of service to others, which I think we have found that it is and it can be. So I will take myself off here. There we go. I stopped sharing. So that's all I have for you all tonight. Thank you all for spending your happiness hour with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Seton. That was really priceless. We so appreciate you sharing your story. It's remarkable, really.